It's turning on. Okay, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I want to just let you know that I appreciate everyone being here. This has been a wild time for us. I know when we were talking the other day, we had decided that, or I had offered to do a process session. I thought maybe a couple of people would show up and we could talk about some things that I've talked about in class and try to brainstorm together. But I think a lot of us are eager and hungry and trying to figure out what it is we can do or how we can play a role. And so here we are. And I've tried my best to put together a somewhat of a presentation, but I want to let folks know it's really loose, and we're trying to conceptualize and bring things together. And I might ramble a little bit, but we're going to try to draw it in and get some feedback. There'll be certain points. Professor Kendrick is here with us. She's moving into the role of our graduate coordinator here in the School of Social Work on our Norman campus, and I really appreciate her helping me today. She's going to be monitoring the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat. But she's going to monitor and feed stuff to me on the back channel too, to identify some themes, particularly when we get to a couple of areas where I'm going to ask you to start thinking or processing about what this could look like for you, for your organizations, what ideas you might have. So know that chat is there. We're monitoring it. Professor Kendrick's going to help me try to do that as well, since I'm really working to gather some thoughts and keep things going. Yeah, thank you for that. Before I get into the presentation part, I just want to be really explicit and really clear that the point of this and the overarching theme and what brings us together is that Black Lives Matter. We are in a space in our community, in our country, where we're really struggling, and we're seeing a lot of turmoil, a lot of unrest. And this is by no account going to be like the solution to all our problems, but I wanted to kind of talk through some things that have helped me organize and have helped me try to initiate change at systemic and community levels, and some things that have kind of stuck with me. We won't have all the answers, but I want everyone here to know, and I want to explicitly express that I'm trying to figure it out. I think a lot of us are trying to figure it out, and I appreciate the fact that everyone's here today to kind of talk through this stuff. What I'm hopeful, what this has kind of turned into for me, what started off as an idea around a process session, now has, I think right now at this moment, we have 132 people logged in. As we start collecting the chat, I'm actually going to use the chat as qualitative data later on. And hopefully we can go through that chat after it's all over, it's particularly in the places where we're asking people what their perspectives or ideas might be, to try to develop a few themes around action items for our community specifically. So know that I'm hopeful to be able to send that stuff back to folks, along with some other documents and things that we'll prepare that have kind of emerged over the past 24 hours. We want to try to give you that feedback too on kind of how this, how the talk goes and what we learn from it. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for your patience and grace as I try to help navigate the conversation and move us through and share some ideas. So with all of that, I will move into, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to make sure that this is working. Here is our desktop. I'm going to share that and move this into a presentation mode. All right. So Charlotte, I got the thumbs up, so it's looking good. You guys might see my head over to the side a little bit, but otherwise the majority of the screen should be our presentation, right? Does it look good, Charlotte? I'm gonna keep rolling. Okay, thank you. All right, everybody. So if I see several alumni of the program, folks that I've been fortunate enough to have in class and learn with. Many of you have heard the term before because I've used it, the notion of being a tactical radical. And I've talked about that in class and tried to process through it, but we've never actually put it together as a prescriptive plan or taken some of these tenets and outlined them. So I think that's kind of how this has emerged, or what we're going to do a little bit on today. We're going to process what it would mean to be a tactical radical, particularly as we try to address the systemic problems of racism and how we can go about reform in our law enforcement communities and law enforcement systems. There'll be several times I want to be careful to explain where I'm coming from in this, as not to say that this is the only solution or that it is the right solution. I just want to try to think through a lot of things that I've figured out over the years are embedded in me from my previous experience. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we move forward. You might notice, I don't know if you can see my cursor as I move it around. I'm hopeful that you can see. Charlotte, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my little pointer or cursor? Okay. I'll use it throughout the presentation to kind of identify things. A lot of folks who've been around for the past couple of years might have recognized the swan there, and I put that image up here. It's in a way, it's become a symbol that helps keep me grounded, and I've shared it with students. We've used it through the Knee Center. At this point, I have it on my CV. I have it on my website. It's become more and more, particularly over the past year, a symbol for me. But it's a symbol that I first came across and started identifying with about 20 some odd years ago, when I started my work, particularly on a tactical unit or a SWAT team in the Little Rock metro area. That's where it comes from. As a young SWAT officer, I think this image stuck with me because as we were going through training, when you think about tactical units, there's a lot of mixed opinion and a lot of mixed emotion, and we want to recognize that. What I want to do is try to take that and turn those philosophy pieces into something we can use to change the system. But I start with the swan because for those of you that don't know, the swan swims with one leg. So it tucks one leg up behind it, and with the other leg, it really furiously under the water is working to stay on track, is working to get where it needs to go, with a flurry of activity below the surface. We don't see that. What we see is the swan as a graceful image kind of gliding across the surface. When just underneath the surface, there's all this chaos that's going on. I relate to that. Many of us are in a place where we're interacting in communities. We're trying to deal with stressful, chaotic situations. And right underneath the surface, our heart is beating out of our chest. We feel the pressure. We feel the chaos. But I try to remember that that it's important to present with as much grace as possible so that I can be effective. We'll kind of close with a conversation. I'll mention something now that we'll get back to, and that's the notion that in tactical units, they talk about how slow is smooth and smooth is fast. To be effective, it's important to slow down, particularly in moments of chaos, that actually helps us be far more effective. So recognize when we're being reactive, recognize when we're scared. All of us are getting scared, and find a way in the midst of all that chaos to present with some grace. And the swan for me is an image that helps me stay focused and brings me back to that. So if you see that through the Knee Center, if you see it on buttons and stickers, if you see it on my resume or website or on the presentations I have, that's just a constant reminder of me to myself that we can all do these incredibly beautiful things. Even when just below the surface, we are stressed out and struggling and trying to figure it out, and it feels really chaotic. So that's what that image means to me, and that's kind of where I hope we can all come from and start from. And I'll go ahead and get us started. So first things first, give you a little bit of my background. As Professor Kendrick mentioned, currently I am serving as the Assistant Director of Research for the Anna and Henry Zero School of Social Work. I'm also an Associate Professor and the Director of the Knee Center for Strong Families. In these roles, I try to find ways to use research as a mechanism for the improvement of the human condition. That can happen in a lot of different ways. We're trying to support social work research, and that's what makes social work research particularly different. That is our calling card. We want to join with communities and do collaborative research projects that are specifically and unapologetically there to try to improve human life. That's what we're trying to do. That's our intervention. My specialties, over the years, my research has focused primarily on forensic psychopathology and the development of differential criminal behavior, or the impact of criminal behavior on people. I've paid specific attention to gender, trauma, and kind of these intersections of difference or marginalization and how things affect people differently. At this point, I've made a bit of a turn, and I'm also exploring, we know that every human being is capable of doing some pretty horrific things based on a constellation of events that would include our own trauma histories. We've gotten to a place in the research now where I'm also interested in how is it that some people are able to endure incredible hardship and then take that trauma and turn it into purpose and success. That notion of the hero's journey. In any comic book you've ever read or literature that we explore, we see that people often go through incredible hardship and then manage somehow to turn that into a drive for purpose and positivity. And so even though that hardship can make us do or influence us to do bad things in life, how can that hardship also be a fulcrum for positive development for people? So that's where we're at in this space now. Also, this presentation and actually this perspective would not be around if it wasn't for the first half of my career. I probably wouldn't research these topics had I not started off when I was 21 years old in law enforcement. That was my path, and I've talked pretty openly about how and why I transitioned from law enforcement into social work. We'll talk a little bit more about that as the presentation moves forward. I started off when I was at the academy when I was 21. By the time I was 22, I tried out and made the SWAT team right after my probationary year was over. There's all kinds of good and bad with that. My brain was not developed, but here I was, responsible for making some pretty tough decisions in some really scary scenarios. I served for 6 years on the SWAT team and 5 years as a detective in the police department there. After that, I made the decision to transition into social work, earned my MSW, and work my clinical experiences, particularly with risk assessment, offender treatment, complex criminal behavior, all those types of things. So this particular conversation isn't necessarily about that. I'm leaning a little bit more and wanting to explain that law enforcement history and take some of those lessons learned to move forward. Particularly, I think it's important for those folks who don't understand, and I'll explain a little bit more about what SWAT is and what parts of that I want to draw from as we move forward. So why do this now? Like I'd mentioned before, I think we're all struggling. I know I'm struggling, and I know that I feel a particular responsibility due to the dual nature of my career to try to bridge this space and understand it more, deeply. Having lived and worked in both worlds, I think that there's a false dichotomy between social action and law enforcement, and we can reframe that, and we'll get to a little bit of that more in a minute. but I also want to be really, really clear. This is about basic humanity as well. The system is not working. The system was not built to work correctly. I believe we can change the system, but we need to address the realities of the system and how it is not working right. It's not good enough for me anymore to live by the low bar that's set. I've talked about this in the context of feminism, for example. It's not good enough for me to just be a man who doesn't sexually assault women. That bar is pretty low. Being an ally, being a supporter, respecting the dignity of human beings is a lot more than just not hurting people. Being an ally, being anti-racist is a lot more than not owning slaves, right? So we hear these arguments of, I didn't hurt anybody. That was my ancestors. That was years ago. We're going to get past all that stuff. I want to move from the space of being an ally, move toward being the space of being an accomplice and helping people out. And I don't know exactly what that path is. I think we're all working to try to find lots of different ways to get there. There are scholars that can help us get there in ways far more refined than mine. But I did want to have this conversation and share some of these perspectives because I think it's important for me to be able to say this stuff outwardly and openly. And we'll try to use some of the things that I've learned to reframe them and use them for our goals. I'm going to click on this picture. If you don't want to see it, I'm going to display it. So here's the trigger warning. This image has caused me to think a lot. If you don't want to look at it, it's going to be the image from Minneapolis. So feel free to look away and I'll tell you when it's gone, but I'm clicking on it right now because I think it's important for us to remember. I am struggling right now, and I have been for years, but when you see this with the hand in the pocket, the look on the face, this is a major problem. If I was called to testify as an expert witness on the forensic psychopathology of this murder, I would be hard pressed to not say that the person killing this other person is enjoying what they're doing. He's relaxed, his hands in his pocket, he's looking down, he's exhibiting his power and authority clearly and openly for everyone to see. And in this situation or scenario, we see other police officers who are watching it happen as well. We're going to talk more about that. I cannot, in good faith, sit around, and I can't see how any human being in our society can sit around in good faith and say that this is okay or that we don't know. The images are out there. There's no way to say you didn't know from this point forward. And I think that it's important for us to pay attention to. This is a murder, and one where one person is exhibiting their power and authority in an exhibition type style for everybody else to see. All right, just so you know, if you had decided not to look at that image, I've scrolled off of it now and I'm moving forward. Got to be honest and admit what I don't think we can do today or what it's not. And so we can set up the frame. These next few slides, I want to set up the frame for what we're going to discuss over the following hour and a half. And I think this is an important one that we get right out of the gate. Today, this particular talk will not be focused on an us versus them or a false dichotomy of one side is good, one side is bad. We just looked at that image. We know what's wrong. But I also want to be really clear, and this is a stance I've had to take and I've articulated, and I'm still searching to figure out how to articulate it more efficiently, particularly with my law enforcement brothers and sisters. And that's that rooting out racism and abuse of power is potentially the most pro-police thing I can think of. It is not anti-police to say we want to root out and get rid of systemic racism and the people who disgrace the profession, and abuse their power. This is not an us versus them. This is about fixing the problem. So my perspective is going to come from that place. It is a good thing. It is pro-police. It is supportive of justice in our community to root out the problem. And so I don't want to come across as if I'm minimizing the problem, but I do want to kind of call that frame for the approach that I'm trying to think through as we move forward today. I think it's a false dichotomy that we have to say either Black Lives Matter or blue support blue lives, or what. These things are not competing frameworks, and we need to stop acting as if the respect of Black life is the equivalent of disrespect to police. That is not true, and I don't accept it. That's a false assumption, and that logic isn't going to fly with me. The respect of Black life is a pro-police move. And so I think we have to reframe that and make sure that we're communicating that effectively. And I've got some strategies, particularly as we get to the organizational culture piece, that I think are important. I also want to just go ahead and know this is not a quick, easy solution. I have two daughters, right? 6 and 10. A lot of times I have to I got to kiss boo-boos. I got to express this stuff. That's not what we're doing here. This is more like dentistry. We're going to have to dig out a cavity. We're going to have to do the hard, painful work. And then we're going to fill that thing in and make it healthy. I think that's the approach we got to. It's not band-aiding. It's not putting something superficial on. I think it's time to dig out the cancer and do an actual systemic intervention. I also want to recognize the concept from Maslow here. If the only tool you have is the hammer, you see every problem as a nail. As a community, systemically, we've expected law enforcement to handle things that law enforcement is not prepared to handle. That is part of the problem and part of the systemic change we need to adopt. We also want to kind of explore that this is one strategy or idea. There's a lot of we need a diversity of ideas and approaches that we can collaboratively work with together. Trying to use one solution to fix every problem is part of what's gotten us here. So I want to go ahead and acknowledge that before I move forward. All right. So a couple of statements to continue moving the conversation forward. And this is just backing up that first one that I made. So I'm going to keep coming back to this over and over and over again. I think we need to abandon the notion that valuing Black life is an anti-law enforcement move. And we, as social workers, have a particular capacity to be able to communicate and mitigate and manage between these systems to try to find a tactical solution. But in order to do that, I do think it takes a bit of reframing. We have to be willing to question the assumptions we have about our community, about our world, about ourselves. And then in this very clinical way, I come back to one of the best out of all of my education. This one phrase from my social work training comes back over and over and over again: is what we're doing now getting us what we want? Is the life you want coming to you based on the behaviors that you exhibit? Are we doing the things we need to do to get what we want to get? And if not, how do we identify, isolate, pull those things out and start making some absolute and specific changes? With this conversation, I was forced to try to give my first run at an actual definition of a tactical radical. And I'm sure this will change over time, but as of the past 24 hours, this is where I'm at. So like I've tried to express in many classes, and many of you have probably heard before who are in my classes, I want to encourage, I think being tactically radical is to maintain the radical sensibilities and energy, keeping that radical heart, right? How do we maintain radical sensibilities and an energy and focus directed toward the transformation of systems, while at the same time incorporating creative and purposeful strategies, teamwork, and intelligence to gain control of these systems through action with balanced and calculated risk? And we'll talk more about kind of where that comes from and how I think we can try to start moving through that. Again, we want to maintain that we expect, I'm not going to apologize for wanting to change the world. I don't think that that is naive. I don't think that is something that we should lose. That is what I'm here to do. And I will mess up at it over and over and over again, but I'm going to keep trying. And I think that's what the heart of social work is about. I believe that people can change, and I believe that change is possible. I'm going to keep that energy. I'm going to keep that heart, and I'm going to try to be smart about how I pull it off. I've been through many experiences in the past, and I'm going to take what I learned from engaging in really scary situations and try to apply it in this context. And a lot of that is about being creative, being thoughtful, being purposeful, good teamwork, and then calculated risk. How do we stay alive as we engage the system? All right. So a little bit of background to set us up for some more of this conversation. I appreciate everyone bearing with me as I move this thing forward. From the law enforcement perspective, where did a lot of these concepts come from? Where did special weapons and tactics teams come from? A lot of it was born out of the 60s and a political response to some increasing problems. The world was changing. People were pushing back. Different police organizations or law enforcement saw that people were becoming more heavily armed. They were dealing with bank robberies or hostage situations where basic street level police officers were out-armed or outgunned. And so the decision was made to try to incorporate specialized tactical units that could manage these situations, these high-risk situations as needed. It's ballooned into something way more now. And I'm going to also own this one here. I think the last place in the world that a SWAT team is needed is at a protest. We do need these situations in a hostage barricade. We do not need these at a peaceful protest. It serves, it's absolutely antithetical to the mission. And that's maybe a conversation for another day, but I do want to own that as I'm going forward. This is not glorifying tactical units, but I feel like we need to explain a couple things. So we're going to see how to take some of these things that I learned and transition them into policy change. So the world changed in the 60s and 70s. Political movements pushed toward these militarization units to handle these more things, and it's gotten a bit out of control as we move forward. But the original purpose was always to stop or prevent the loss of life. Tactical units are not military units. A lot of the same tools are shared, but the point is to take over and prevent the loss of life. Safety is the first priority in this. This is an important concept because if part of this safety that I'll continue to talk about over this session is if it's like that concept of putting on your mask first on the airplane if it's going down. If we do things or make actions that take us out of the game, then that disempowers us or takes away our ability to actually affect systemic change. So part of that prevention of loss is prevention of a loss of our position and power and opportunity to affect change. So we'll continue to talk about that as we move forward. How these teams function. This is not a value statement that it is good or right or bad or wrong, but this is how the philosophy works. When a dramatic high-risk event happens where the loss of life is possible, the point is to deploy these teams to take over and control that space, to eliminate the threats to life. The term that's used, not that I agree with this term and how it was chosen, but that notion of violence of action. when you do deploy to take over this space, the unrestricted use of speed, strength, surprise, and even aggression to achieve dominance. That is how the deployment happens. So we know that that's part of it. Again, I take out the value statement from it and just say that when you do decide to take action, you got to be ready to take action. That's the way that we'll transition this. Yeah, I've seen the violence of action is a phrase that is pulled over from the military, particularly in regards to CQB. We're going to take that and repurpose it for our change efforts as we move forward. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what we're dealing with here too. Law enforcement systems and what we need to do and what ideas that I think are really important for us as we're trying to address systemic change. One of the first of those is organizational culture. There's lots of scholarship out there, and people are probably somewhat familiar with some of this research on organizational culture. We talk about it a bit in our social work education process. But we have these cultural norms that get established within the organization. This is particularly strong in law enforcement organizations. So a bond gets created, and we want to think about this. I ask you to think about it clinically in this section of the talk. What happens in this closed system when people, particularly law enforcement officers, go through these experiences together? They are presented with fear or situations that induce fear within themselves. That notion of not crossing the line. I post this picture on there because it has multiple meanings to me. That organizational culture starts inspiring in people a need to take care of each other first. That's a trauma response. And we can say that there's lots of different things that we can talk about with it. I don't want to spend too much time, but I want to address in that organizational culture, because of that trauma response, we start to see things develop, patterns being a very closed and distrusting system. So a system that doesn't trust outsiders and is highly suspicious. There's also a knowledge of legal process and the legal system. So as the closed system protects itself, it protects itself inside a context of understanding how legal systems work. You do not speak up. You do not give out information. You are highly protective. There's an expectation of protecting each other above everything else. And any deviation from this system would mean that you are removed from the system. You're no longer protected by the system. So I think that organizational culture piece is something that we have to be very thoughtful and proactive about how we address it. The system will not change until we have some ideas around how to address the organizational culture. This is not a new area of research. It is not an easy place for us to try to figure out. It's not cut and dried. People have been trying to figure out law enforcement organizational culture for decades, and how it's problematic, particularly in communities of color. And we got lots of theoretical ideas and not a lot of success so far. So community engaged policing. If you're not familiar with an old friend of mine, Tommy Norman from North Little Rock, I encourage you to look up Tommy Norman on Instagram. This notion of, I was talking to Tommy on the phone. I said, how is it that you've stayed alive in your career for 20 years, engaged in a habit of interaction with the community that is not necessarily aligned with the organizational culture? And it's a struggle. It takes highly committed people, very strong people, to stand up against that organizational culture and be able to stay in the profession. So Tommy Norman's not the only one out there, but he's a great example and just somebody I know that's been a wonderful example of how to push back against that organizational culture. And we got to find more ways to infiltrate that way. Kind of the next area that I want to at least mention before we get started in some of the tactics is systemic oppression. Again, we have a room full of social work folks here, so I think systemic oppression is at the core of our problem. Recognizing that this is historical, it is often covert. A lot of officers, I think, don't realize the degree to which they participate in systemic oppression. And there's a reason that people are reluctant to accept that we engage in that. I'll mention here, a few years ago in the Me Too movement happened, I remember standing in front of my classroom in Zero Hall. Some of you might have been in there. And was really struggling personally. And I had to come to this point where I voiced out loud I consider myself as an educator to be a servant. As a professor, I serve my students. I'm there to try to, and I felt like it was important for me to say that even though I've spent decades, my entire professional life, trying to figure out how to reduce violence, particularly violence that's directed at women and children, even with all of that, I had to come to terms and realize that I benefit from feminine fear. Because of my maleness and my place in society, that I actually, no matter how hard I work, I still receive the latent benefits of feminine fear. And that's a tough pill to swallow. It doesn't make you feel honorable or noble or all these things that we wish we were, right? I found myself again a year or two later, after that tough thing to say, standing in front of a group of students after racist event after racist event after racist event occurred on my campus, our campus at OU. And I said, a couple of years ago, I came to this realization that was really tough pill to swallow, but I had to accept it and voice it and say it to move forward. And I'm standing in front of you today saying, I benefit from racism systemically, no matter how hard I want to push back against it. That is an uncomfortable thing to say. It does not make you feel good. And I think that herein lies part of the problem with systemic racism, particularly in the context of the organizational culture of police. If law enforcement organizations and individuals are to accept the reality that systemic oppression is built into the system, then that is in contrast to how they perceive their system to be as fair and equitable and just, and promoting the public good of protecting and serving. So I think we have to recognize that that's part of our challenge as we're trying to change these systems. We're going to be up against something really, really fierce. Human beings, all of us, don't want to admit that we're not as good as we want to be, or that we benefit from other people being hurt or taken advantage of. It feels gross. It feels hurtful. But these complexities we got to figure out. So if we're accepting that those are parts of the systemic oppression, particularly in this system that is so closed down and locked down, that's where we're presented with the problem. I think that's why we haven't seen widespread change. That's one of our major reasons right there. We've got to figure out a way tactically to infiltrate and get in there and start addressing some of these problems. I think part of that is by investigating the people. This is a newer area that I've started thinking about, the psychology of police officers in general. I mentioned Tommy Norman because, man, he's got it right. I didn't realize that back when I worked in the same area, same part of the country as him, when I was in that same metro area. I thought he was kissing babies. I had bought in to the idea that there's only one way to do things, that I wanted to chase bad guys and kick in doors, and that was the way to clean up the the community. I was blinded. I was wrong. But what he's done is powerful, and it's what we need. So how do we acknowledge that we need a systemic change, and how do we get people to buy in, particularly those frontline men and women? And I think we have to explore the psychology of officers in general. Just like social workers, these people do not get into the profession of law enforcement to make money. There is no money. It is dangerous, hard work. It takes a toll on your body. It takes a toll on your family. It takes a toll on people emotionally. Used to be an inside joke that we would talk about, like, I had to pass a psych screen to get this job, and somehow I can't pass a psych screen now. What's the one thing that changed? Well, for me, it was being on the job, right? It's tough work. It impacts people. These people, I believe, for the vast majority, obviously we have murderers who abuse power and are there because they like it, like the image that we saw earlier. But I believe that the majority of these people do have a motivation that's based on a sense of honor and duty and justice and service. How can we use that tactically to change the organizational culture? I think this is the key that I want to present today. How do we identify that as our entry point? I believe that if we can really fundamentally change the conversation or the narrative so that police officers on the front line see a sense of honor in standing up to racist organizational culture, a sense of duty and honor in pushing back against some of those things, that we have the ability to really affect a bigger change, if that makes sense. So we're going to try to keep pushing on that. How do we use that as our entrance point? I think if we reframe it, we got to be really careful from an organizational culture and psychology of police officers. I've talked about this before with students and in other settings. If we go in, and we know this as clinicians, let's see, I think somebody's unmuted and I've got my screen going crazy here, so I can't tell who. Be sure and check your stuff and make sure you're muted so that it doesn't mess up people's screens. But yeah, I've talked about this in settings before. If we can find a way to address these things by gaining partnership rather than saying you're doing it wrong, then I think it's just it's a much easier win. It's a better sell. I think we get there faster. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that from a tactical perspective, if you want to affect the most change as quickly as possible, it's about reframing this and getting folks on board. If we go, the organizational culture is such that if we go, it's only creates resistance to go in and push a sense. If you try to make people feel guilty, they'll hide in this culture. And so I want us to just be thoughtful about how do we both maintain justice. We need to charge people. We just heard today that the officer that murdered, it's been increased to a murder 2, and the bystanding officers in Minnesota have now been charged as well. When somebody kills somebody unjustly, we need to handle that just like somebody in the community. That is important. And how do we create space for people to do the right thing? That's going to be part of our problem or struggle or something that we're thinking about as we move forward. All right. Just for time's sake, I'm going to keep on going. So, nuts and bolts. How do we do that? What is it to be tactical? I'm not giving away any trade secrets here. There are a lot of high school kids right now that can go online and learn how to be really great at Call of Duty by reading about these concepts. So but I am going to kind of walk through some of the concepts that, to me, I didn't realize until years later that they had really stuck in my mind and impacted my behavior to such a strong degree. These things that I had gotten used to stay alive in the almost 100 different call outs that I went on in over 6 years, and all the training and experience. A lot of these things ended up becoming ingrained in my subconscious. And so when I go to address problems, particularly problems that scare me, these are the things that I automatically default to. And I've been trying to unpack and think about how we can apply these and how I've applied them into new spaces. Because I want to reframe that even though these things are used in ways that can make us really uncomfortable in our community sometimes, they can also be used in ways by us. Now, keep it, when SWAT teams come in, when tactical units come in, they're coming into situations that the police are scared of. That is the bottom line. They shouldn't be there unless it's an extreme situation. So we're going to take the tactics and approaches and ideas that the system is already using and try to think through how could we use those ourselves to create systemic change. How do we adapt that? Because again, this is not the only way to do it, but maybe this can be one way for us to start organizing movements. And it's just it's an idea. So when I was trying to think on how to present these, I broke them into 2 areas. One are some kind of core tenets or ideas that are connected to preparation. And then another one is a section of ideas or core tenets that to me are connected more with deployment. So I'll start with some of these in regard to preparation. So what I've done here is to put together kind of a table for you to see. This is literally something that I've thrown together over the past 24 hours. So it doesn't have everything, but it's some of my first thoughts. And this will change over time and hopefully with feedback. This is where we'll really be kind of ramping up the chat. So as I ask these LE questions, or these questions for us to think about systemic change, I want folks to feel free to, in the chat, throw your ideas in there. I'm going to take the ideas that you share. I'll try to comment on some of them. And then we'll kind of think through how to apply them. And I'll do a little bit of qualitative analysis and create a post, kind of a debrief document that I can send back out to anybody who's interested in it, or post it on my website or whatever. There is one question that I see in the chat before I get started on this, and it says, in these deaths with police, is it they move to tactical practices prematurely? The vast majority and to answer that, when we look at the data, and I did a talk, it's available on my website, and I can share that with folks later. I did a talk on use of force deaths in the United States a couple of years ago, ran the data from Bureau of Justice Statistics. Most of the use of force deaths, particularly the ones that we can see overt racism in, are not happening with tactical units. It's street level folks who are exerting force in inappropriate ways. I think a lot of those are fear-based. Some of them, like the one we've just talked about that's inspired our protests right now, does not feel fear-based at all to me. It feels sociopathic and power-based. But most of the time it's not tactical units. It is street level folks who are acting in gross abuses of power. And we see that happen. Most tactical call outs and it's a lack of training. It's actually putting your foot on someone's neck like we saw in this particular event is not acceptable anywhere. No one is trained to do that. In fact, you're told not to do that. You do not restrict airway. That is not what and people know that. So for him to make that choice to restrict that airway was a very intimate and intentional and purposeful crime. So just to kind of help clean some of that up, and I'd be glad to share that the talk. What I found in running the data is that one thing that might be surprising to folks and one thing that may not. The first thing that might be surprising is that while under arrest in the United States, people in general are safer than you are literally just walking down the street. The rates of death as related to use of force are incredibly low. However, use of force is astronomically higher on Black men. So when someone does die, they're far more likely, or Black men, particularly young Black men, are more likely to die from police use of force than any other demographic group. So that part, not shocking. The other part might be a bit shocking. One question before I get started in this one too, interested in the difference of use of force between local police, state police, National Guard. Does different training result in different outcomes? I would be interested in looking at the data specifically on that one as well. My assumption or hypothesis would be that the less training someone has, the more problematic use of force becomes, based on policy and appropriate training. That would be my expectation. The more trained someone is, the quicker they can deal with the problem, which is kind of what we're talking about and what I'm thinking. That's hopefully what I can express as we take some of these concepts and apply them over. The better trained you are, you can quickly jump in and deal with a situation and do it effectively. If you're not trained or acting outside of your training, this was something I'll say this one more time and move on. I don't know that I've said it today, but how brave does someone have to be to put their knee on the neck of a handcuffed man? That man was in handcuffs. Any argument about resisting arrest or that he had committed a crime earlier is irrelevant to me. He was in handcuffs. He was under arrest. There was no need to put a knee in his neck. That is poor training. That is working outside the scope of training. It is completely inappropriate and has to be stopped immediately. Those are some of the things that we have to advocate for. All right, so I'm going to jump back on because I know I've got 1 hour left and I want to leave us plenty of space in here. So when I'm thinking about some of these concepts and how we can apply them, one of the first things that comes up, and in these documents, I've kind of got it organized by concept. If you can see here, by the facet inside that concept, where that idea came to me from prior training, and then what could we do with that notion or that concept if we were moving it toward an application for systemic change in our law enforcement community. So this is where I'll ask you questions that I'm hopeful to get feedback as we move through. Throw stuff in there in the comments or in the group chat, and we're going to do our best to moderate that. So the first concept that I want to mention in our preparation section is training. Can't say it enough. What I learned from this experience was you have to train, and then you have to train some more. That you don't know exactly what you're going to see, but you need to be ready for as much as you can before it happens. If you're waiting to train and prepare for something after it happens, you're already way behind. So there are a couple of facets of that I think are, important to note. Consistency. We want to train more than we need, especially in times where nothing's happening. And when we move that to an application place, this is where I would ask you to think. All of us think, feel free to share in our chat. What would training look like? What would preparation look like in the context of our problem? We've identified the problem of systemic racism in our law enforcement systems. What would you need to prepare for as a social change agent to prepare for times when we're going to need to address this? So that's a big question. We're going to keep pushing through these, and hopefully with saturation, we'll get a little bit more comfortable with trying to think it through. Absolutely. I'm seeing some themes already. Relationship building, immersive experience, exposure, soft skills. Yes. Yes. So those are some of the areas we want to start thinking through with training. So keep on posting stuff, and I'm going to keep moving and try my best to swing back and forth. Another thing inside our training that I want us to think about is a diversity of training and skill set. So of course we all want to be good at some things, but we want to be good at multiple things as well. So how do we train for all kinds of different scenarios or situations? How do we, as change agents, as social workers, as advocates, prepare ourselves to deal with some of these problems? How are we going to change this system? If we're going to use these tactical ideas to change the system, what do we need to do? So how will you and your team develop the skills you need? And then in training, I think there's this facet of intentionality that I think is very important. So is Oklahoma City going to be the same as Lawton? Is Oklahoma City going to be the same as Boston? We need to know our community, we need to know our environment, and we need to start working and training and thinking about how to apply some of these things and make calculated predictions on what to expect in our interactions. How do we try to prepare for that kind of thing? What kind of skills do we need to create systemic change in our context and environment? So seeing some great comments. I see one particularly about the complexity of lived experience. How do we train people to be ready to engage with all facets of what a human being is? Listening, connection. I see a theme kind of emerging in the comments around relationship. I think that's right. I really feel that. When I talked to Officer Norman, that was one of the main things. He said consistency in relationship. That's how he affects his community. He shows up year after year. How do we start working to create those things in the system? All right. So I'm going to keep moving as we continue this side conversation too. So keep it coming. The next concept that I think is important in preparation is recruitment. So if we want to be effective advocates for criminal justice reform and for law enforcement system reform, we have to build a team that's going to be effective at initiating and following through with those reform interventions. What does that team look like? How do we put that team together? So we need to recruit people with diverse skills. Our team should be better than the sum of its parts. Together, we need people. I need people on my team that can do things I can't do, or can manage those areas of my weakness much more efficiently. Working together, we need to find the right people. So that comes to that next question on if we're talking about changing the law enforcement system. So how do we get the people that can fill in those gaps and do the things that we need? Maybe we need, in a context, here's an example. So maybe we need our local politicians, and maybe we need critical policy analysis. Maybe we need somebody that can do data analysis. Maybe we need somebody that's just really fantastic at communicating and talking to people. Building relationships. Whatever those skill sets are, we want to respect that everybody needs on our team when we're trying to create these policy changes. How do we get the right players at the table? Another thing that I think is really important that we have to be careful with, because we all work in organizations, we all work in bureaucracies. Substance, not flash. I don't need people on my team that are there to get their own highlight reel going. I know sometimes we have to make concessions and figure this thing out. But what we found over and over again at tryouts was that people on tactical teams that are there to show off how awesome they are get in the way of team success. So we want folks that can get emotion under control, that can get stuff done, and that aren't a distraction. So it's tough, it's challenging, but we want to start working toward that. I think it kind of goes without saying it's more important to have somebody that's smart than somebody that's strong. More important on these teams to have a smart guy than a tough guy. That's something that stuck with me. I watched so many tough guys try to come into these really scary situations and just crumble. We got to surround ourselves with smart, capable people, and that's really important. Also, when we're recruiting our team, we need people that can be calm under pressure. The point of trying to put together a tactical response to community system intervention means that we're going to have to talk across political spectrums. We're going to have to engage in all these different spaces. We need to recruit people and help people maintain composure. That is not easy right now. But some of you folks that are out here on this call, you remember being in class and I would talk about that neon sign, right? When somebody is resistant to treatment, they are telling you exactly where you need to stay. Like when they're non-compliant, they're telling us this is the area that they feel uncomfortable with. Let's stay in this space. When we take that idea, if people are having an emotion, all of us will have emotional reactions. So when we're having that emotional reaction, we need to be able to check ourselves. We need to create a culture in our team so that we're able to help check each other and get us back on task, stay calm. Another one that we want to find people that are going to help us in creative ways. So just because we've affected policy change the way it's always been done before is irrelevant to me from a tactical perspective. We'll take that knowledge, we'll use that knowledge, it's good, but if it doesn't serve our purpose and get our goals met now, then we don't have to do it that way. So forge new paths. We want people. So how do we create culture and that will forge new paths, solve problems quickly, move toward the goal? And then I have decision makers. So we want to recruit into, as we're preparing for this, I think finding people that'll make decisions. Indecision, for me, in this context and with this model, indecision is bad. Doing nothing is how people get hurt. It's how we risk the thing not working right. So I'll come back and I keep saying this idea of calculated risk. It's not making irrational decisions. It's trying to create a culture and recruit the people under your team that know how to calculate risk efficiently in the midst of a really horrible spot and make the best decision they can given the circumstances. You need to be able to trust each other and help each other make those decisions and move things forward. Movements get stalled because somebody stops, and then the momentum of an entire movement can come to a grinding halt. So we want to create a culture on our team as we're trying to create this systemic change. It's going to take so much energy and effort that we want to continue moving forward. We have to accept that we'll never be perfect. We want to keep trying to keep this thing moving forward. So for us in this context of systemic law enforcement change, what are we willing to sacrifice to keep moving forward? How will we find people who will continue and have the kind of the gumption to follow through and get things done? I see in the chat right now the morale killers. How do we change that perspective? Implicit bias trainings, use of forensics trainings have been implemented and lost a lot in lots of law enforcement agencies and seen as morale killers. I There's, I'll mention Dr. Natalia and I last summer did an implicit bias training with about 100 criminal investigators. And I think there are ways to do it, but we want to understand the organizational culture and the psychology of law enforcement people. There's a lot of ways to turn people off. So we want to address these folks in a way to help them be heroic. I think that's part of the key. That's part of even when there's a history organizationally of things that are anything but. Really great piece of feedback in recruitment. The ideal candidate held specific expertise and also lived experience as a member of a marginalized group you're engaging. I think you absolutely need people on your team that provide a diversity of experience and perspective. Absolutely. Great feedback. I'm going to keep moving us. Let's see. Oh, man, look at this. Fancy, fancy. I think that goes into the notion of specialization a little bit as well. In units, of course, we need a central voice. So that idea of the commander, the team, the leader. I think of that as I apply it from a small tactical unit to a large systemic change movement as what is the central idea formed around, and how do we have consistency of idea? This is another space where we see movements struggle. We've used digital and social media as a way to engage lots of people, and sometimes it's hard to keep on message or keep things, as we have clustered cells that are making progress forward, it's hard to have a consistent unified message. And I want to recognize that as a reality and add that with a tactical approach, we need a set unified message. I think it starts in that space because we have a common goal that we're going to isolate and focus on. I'm not a Saul Alinsky. I don't have all the rules. I don't have great experience as a community organizer. I think we have some other events coming. Dr. Brady, for example, that's going to really have a great event that I'm looking forward to on community organizing. But what I can tell you is that if you want to tactically address something, you need a central goal, and you're going to focus on that thing and really get after it. So from this perspective, we need that. We need specific leaders in the space. So delegated leaders of subgroups. How can we place team leads in specific strategic ways? So if we're looking for systemic law enforcement change, one of the best things we can have is somebody internal. We need champions internally that we can lean on that can help drive different components of the plan. We want to try to identify who some of those team leads can be. I think that's very important. And how will we utilize them and help them make sure that the plan and the centralized core idea is being efficiently. One of the things, this is not, we watch a lot of movies, right? So the American Sniper. Every tactical team, most of them have snipers. The main job of that person is to protect and gather information. So it's not like a military kind of scenario. Yes, they are kind of protecting from way up. But the most important role that they serve for the team in a tactical situation is to be able to observe and gather information and relay that back to the people who are going to be on the front line. This is an important role. So as we're preparing, we want to identify who will be the folks that are great at gathering information. So who can do that? Who can be successful? How you do that? And then you're going to have some very specific personalities. So operators on the team. Many years ago, I was on the entry side. I was a breacher. So the breacher creates the opening. And when I think about that, we do not have to use the front door, right? So if we're trying to get into this organization, we don't want to come in from the way we want to have as many options on how to engage as possible. Who are the gatekeepers that can help us get into the system? And what is it going to take? What do we need to plan for to get into the system? Once we are on the ground, who is it that's going to actually move in and take control of the space? And we're going to continue talking about some of these concepts as we move forward. We're still in preparation, and I have just a couple left. This is remarkably important. I can't stress this enough. The DIY kind of mentality. If whatever we need to get our movement started and affect change in these organizations doesn't exist already, I want to encourage us to be willing to make it. What tools do we need to make? Just because it doesn't exist doesn't mean that it can't exist. And we want to get rid of that whole mentality that to affect change, we have to use everything that already has been used. We might need to create stuff. So what are the tools that we want to think through creating? Absolutely. Kate throws for breachers, LEOs, district attorneys, city council members. Absolutely. Absolutely. So this idea of resource development. So part of that DIY, we want to have an acquisition network. If any of our military folks are in there, it might have a chuckle with that one, but it's very true. We want to acquire what we need in the moment. If you've got a school that's got an active shooter in it and you're a TAC team, then having blueprints of that school would be really great. So having a contact who's on the city planning department who can get us a copy of the blueprints to the school could be a really good idea. Having them on speed dial ready to go. That's just the example in that context. If we throw that over and relay that on organizational change, who are the people who can help us get those needs met that we might not know? So if we can't build it, if we can't do it, if we don't have access to it, who do we need to be able to call to get access to the tools we need? All right. So all of those are a cluster of concepts that I tend to default back to when I'm thinking through what is the social problem that I want to address, and how are some of these things going to help me get my goals met? How will they help us move the idea or the movement forward? Where are we at on time? Whew! I'm taking your whole afternoon up. I was thinking there's no way that this will actually go 2 hours, but here I am. My apologies, folks. I'm just glad you're here. Now, after preparation is one thing and deployment is another. And these things are separate to me because now when I'm thinking deployment, I'm thinking about the actual nuts and bolts of pulling it off. So not necessarily just preparing for it, but if we want to affect this change, how do we make that happen? And the reasoning for the engagement or the reasoning for the deployment that we see first up here, man, it can have a lot. It can come from a lot of places. Today, as we stand in this space, we are in crisis response. An event happened that brought something to our consciousness as a community, and people like me, people like us, are sitting here going, what are we going to do about it? What are some things we can do about it? The crisis happened, and here we are. So we're in that space. So we should have been able to predict if we were planning on this. We know that racism is a problem in our planning stage. We know that there's systemic racism in our criminal justice system. We see the manifestations of that, but we feel kind of disempowered. Maybe we're not motivated. Maybe the COVID's got us and we're sitting around eating Fruity Pebbles like I am all COVID long. We haven't paid attention. Something happens, a crisis happens, and here we are. So we are deploying right now after an unexpected event. So in that moment, we didn't plan on showing up today until the bad thing happened. Now the thing happened and here we are. So what types of events could we expect? Are we prepared to act when they arise unexpectedly? How do we start calculating the risk in that spot? What else will have to happen to keep us mobilized? Maybe that's one of those questions to think about. The energy that we have, that in less than 24 hours, all of us decided to come together and think about this together over lunch. What do we need to be able to keep that kind of energy and momentum going? Another way that sometimes the reasoning behind deployment is a planned action. Maybe we have a sustained social problem we've been able to think about. We know that in the context of the tactical unit, well, maybe this is a gang headquarters or something. We know that it's there. We know that it's operating. We've been building the intelligence on it. We've been trying to learn about what's going on there. How do we make sure that it's safe? We get to choose when we go. So we will go at 4 o'clock in the morning when hopefully there's a minimum of activity. So in that planned action, we get to make a lot of choices that can increase safety. Safety for us, safety for the mission, safety for all the people. We can be more thoughtful. In the crisis response, we get less chance to plan for those things, and we have to make some different choices. Jordan just posted in the chat, we got to prepare for the verdicts. I think that is absolutely correct. We should be planning for what happens. No matter what happens, we need to be thinking through. Absolutely. As we kind of move forward in the deployment kind of space, I'll talk about some of what we are and what we are not. If we're thinking about this tactically, some action components. We're not talking about taking an army and moving in. And with this conversation, we're talking about the notion of small groups of people who can put together a response that has a massive impact. Right? To do that, we got to be smarter. We're not going to outpower the system. If we stand up and try to overpower this massive historical system, it's going to be really difficult. That's not to say that it can't happen. We're saying that's a difficult thing. However, if we can plan what I would call a surgical strike on a smart target in the system, then that lets us take control of one space. So it gives us our first entrance into the system. All right, so a quick, effective intervention that could either slow down the momentum of the larger system in the negative ways that we don't want, or, and this is a really important point, a quick and effective intervention that makes it easier for the system to move in a more preferred direction. I think this is somewhere, so can we find a way, and this is not a conversation of the means and the ends, or the right or the wrong. This is like, can we find a way to create something that moves the system in a direction that we want? Can we make it easier for the system to make better choices? I throw that one out there just for us to ponder and think about. At the end of the day, that doesn't fix all of our problems. But this tactical approach is not going to fix all of our problems. It's one tool. Can we use this one strategy or tool to try to help the system, influence the system to move in a different direction? To do that, we've got to think about where are the access points or weaknesses in the system. Where could we, a small group of motivated people who are thoughtful and purposeful, where could we intervene in the system rather than trying to take the whole system on at the same time? All right, another action component that I think is important because, and I want to stress, we are a small group of people. We're a small group of people against a massive thing. So we're trying to organize and figure this thing out. The idea of concealment or cover or not exposing ourselves until it's time to take action. The longer that we can prepare, the more effective we can be and the safer it is for all of us. If you're taking on a massive machine, it's It's difficult to stay alive if you're out there banging pots and pans together. I'm not saying that we don't have a right to be furious, that we don't have a right to express our voices. I'm saying with a tactical approach, we wait as long as we can to jump in. And part of that is staying concealed or in cover. So what we want to know the difference between a covered space and a concealed space. Covered spaces or concealed spaces, are we just out of sight? Are we off of the radar? Or are we actually in a safe space for us to plan and organize? What constitutes a safe space for us to plan and organize systemic change, particularly in regards to a mechanism in our culture and community that is set up to not be changed? So we want to be thinking about that. Another action component that I think is important here is this notion of diverted attention. Right, wrong, or indifferent. In a tactical unit, we would use compression grenades or flashbangs. We would use all kinds of diversions to try to get somebody to look the other way so that we could engage the target or that we could take over the environment. So if they're not looking out the window waiting on us, if they run to the back to see what's going on in the back door, then we can come in safely and we can take control of the space before anybody gets hurt. What are those types of diversions or disorientations that we could use to our benefit? I want us to, I think we should think about that. And maybe that's something that has to come up in situation specific moments. But it is something that's very important to our safety and actually getting there. This one I've talked about before too, dominance. So these types of styles, whenever we do expose ourselves, we want to be going full speed. So dominance and speed kind of go together. We're going to take our time. We're going to plan as much as we can. We're going to target and isolate. And then once we do decide to employ an intervention, we want to make sure that, or try our best to understand the scale of that intervention. Like, what do we actually have the capacity to do, if that makes sense? We don't want to bite off more than we can chew. We don't want to take on more than we can successfully take on, because if we get clobbered, then it makes it harder to come back. So part of being tactical is making those choices, and then once the gates are open, we're all in. So we take our time, we plan, we train, we plan, we train, we think, we organize, and then once it's time, you hit that door and you want to take control of that space as quickly as you can. And then, so let's see, I'm going to try to keep pushing through these and then we'll go through some questions. Of course, when we're talking about planning, operational planning, what do you expect to see? And then what's your plan B? What is your plan C? What is your plan D? Have we thought through how we're going to plan this thing? So we want to be well prepared, or as well prepared as we can for as many scenarios as possible. Continue, as we're planning for this engagement, how are we going to gather information both beforehand, and then how do we gather information while we're in the midst of our intervention? We need to be able to adapt in the middle of the intervention. If something is working really well, we want to push that. If it's not working really well, we want to pull back. David Dickerson's on the call, and he and I worked, I remember with over the past year with the Cohen Veteran Network and trying to get these clinics deployed. At one point, we knew operationally that we had to pull back and kind of get into a concealment space and wait. We're finally able to, and through David's work and lots of people's work, we're able to get this massive gift for clinics in the state that'll help support veterans and their families. But we had to be incredibly tactical about that, because at one point in time, if we had been fully exposed and not been ready to go in, that intelligence gathering is going on nonstop. So it's all beforehand. We started, we got the feeling that we needed to kind of pause for a moment or get into a safe space. And then when the time was right, we got the information that, hey, let's get back out and roll with it. So that constant feedback loop is incredibly important. And how are you going to communicate that? So the communications, we need to be able to communicate beforehand, communicate in the moment, and be able to act on that communication. I do see one question. Let's see here from, how do we integrate, so Dedrick asked, how do we integrate social workers and or advocates into police departments so there are more checks and balances before we have to use tactics like this? I think actually the integration of social work into police departments is a tactical move on our part. I think it's a smart move. We've seen it happen, and we haven't seen it as much in Oklahoma. We see some of it in Oklahoma City, some in Tulsa. Police departments on the East Coast tend to have this a lot more frequently. So I think that it is a very smart tactical move to have social workers in police departments. At one point, we tried to find a grant for Norman Police Department where we would pay for a social worker to work alongside a commissioned domestic violence detective. That was another kind of tactical move to try to get these concepts in there. And a lot of times it comes down to money. So I think some of those things moving forward, we're thinking through like, what is the strategy? Sometimes it's about literally, if we find the funding and offer you funding, how do we, that'll be one of the things we'll talk about closer to the end, is funding really matters. So perhaps some of the best things we can do is to help find funding and then offer these positions up and say, hey, we'd love to have a victim advocate. We'd love to place social workers to do different stuff here. That's a big part of it. So we're still on that deployment section. I'll keep kind of moving there. Yep, you found the money. I'm looking for it. We'll keep looking. As we move on into the actual engagement. So we've got the planning done. We've talked about some other concepts. Now we're thinking through engagement. On the approach, again, just coming back to this notion, we want to approach safely. However we're going to engage with this system, we don't want to expose ourselves until the right time. So how do we get close enough to the objective and to safely breach? So once we get to that space of engagement, where's the entry point? How do we get in there? How do you want to make your first move? If we want to change systemic culture, what is the first move? I think of it much like if we were trying to take control of a massive building. This is a massive system, and the organizational culture is a part of the entire system. We got to go room by room, floor by floor, and slowly move through, because we're only a couple of people in the big scheme of things. But a small group, what's the quote? A small group of determined people can change the world. I absolutely believe it. And I think the smarter we are about it, the easier it is for that to happen. So, but we got to be, what can help us do that is to be really thoughtful and tactical about how we do it. Here's on the engagement piece too. I want to, once we enter that space, once we've approached the system, we've decided on the intervention, we have the tools in place, we open the door and they know we're here. Once they know we're here, we have got to work together. We've got to have designated duties to cover each other. We've got to manage our own responsibilities. I need to do what David does. I need to do what I do well, and I need to trust that Carrie can do what Carrie does well. I need to trust that Amy can do what Amy does well. I need to trust that Meadow can do what Meadow does well. We want to be, and we need to cover for each other. If there's one loose spot, we can all go down. So that idea of get rid of the gaps, and we want to move, space it together, a cluster, a space at a time, as we try to make system-wide change. And again, we get back to that notion of slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So it's not that we're creeping around like a turtle, but it's that we want to take just a little bit off so that we're not being reactionary. We want to be purposeful and swift. Purposeful. So, but some things we got to think about. How do we keep this momentum going as we engage resistance? If we're trying to change a massive system, there is going to be resistance. We are going to come across resistance. What can we do? And maybe this is some of the next kind of line of question for folks to really think about. What is the price we're willing to pay? What are the things that we're willing to do when we encounter resistance? How do we want to go about challenging that resistance? How will we take control of that resistance? Those are going to be really tough as we try to influence the organizational culture of a massive system. Even from your own family, isn't that the truth? How do you manage resistance at the dinner table on Sunday or the family gathering? It is really, really tough. So we have to be ready to make those choices when we enter the space. Otherwise, we're not effective. What are going to be the best tactics for us to manage that resistance? It's going to be, that's a challenge. It's a challenge. And then once we're in the space and we've kind of managed the resistance, we need to double back. The worst thing we could do is go through all of this, feel like we're this close to control, and then somebody sneaks in from the back and blows the thing up. It's a lot easier to cause pain than to do all this and in a safe way. So after we take control of the space, we want to turn around, sweep everything, and make sure that that we're still in a safe space. So who and what do we need to account for? What would a safe place look like? How do we know when we've made organizational change? Are we willing to accept change in small increments so that we can get to there? And then should probably go without saying the debrief process. Once you get to that space and you feel like you can take a sigh of relief, oh, we've saved the world, we've fixed everything. Well, we need to collect feedback and figure out what worked and what didn't. Evaluate what worked and what didn't, fix and get better, and then move it forward. So I'm going to make available copies of all of those. Like I said, this is not empirically validated stuff. This is me thinking through how do we tactically address in the moments in my life when I've been the most scared for my own life. These are the things that kept me alive and helped me work to achieve a goal, whether that goal is good or bad, or I have lots of mixed emotions about that part about my service. I think these tenets and these things are actually really can be repurposed. And that's what I'm hopeful in our conversation today, that we can take some of this stuff from this culture and repurpose it into some things that can be helpful for us as we move forward. All right. So I want to kind of hit through a little bit of the review. You see on here, two things that are always going to be there. And that's that we need to isolate and identify the problem, threat, or issue. So in this tactical radical process, you see down here at the bottom, we want to isolate, identify the problem. Part of that is the old Saul Alinsky coming out, right? That this notion of, I hit the wrong button. We want to isolate the problem. We cannot, I believe it would be much more difficult to be successful if we take on the entire system at once. If we be thoughtful, tactical, we can take on one problem at a time and build our way through taking control of the system. And that's what we would do in a hostage barricade situation. That's what we would take you control one zone at a time, and do that as smart as we can, right? So that's what it feels like right now. So that's always there. And then the other part that's always there is to review, assess, and start over. So this is a process that's cyclical, that we want to be creative and we address all the time. But we'll never do it completely right. We want to be, it's calculated risk all the time, calculated risk. What are we willing to give? What are we willing to take? What do we have to see? What are we willing to compromise on? What are we good at? What can we get better at? What did we completely screw up? Because that's going to happen too. And we want to acknowledge that. How do we get better at it? How do we let each other get better? All those types of things. So those are always there in between. So after we identify that problem or what's going on, we got to start training, preparing, building, getting ready to act. Being tactically radical is about being smart and thinking and waiting and preparing as best as you can, but we are always moving toward action. The point is action. So it's not complicity, it's not complacency, it's not waiting. I mean, it is waiting, but it's being thoughtful about it. So how are we moving toward getting ready to act? And then the next step, how are we utilizing strategy? So all of these things that we talked about are so that we don't have to use every single one of them all the time. If you find a couple of those components that can help you in your advocacy process, today's a win for me. If a couple of those things help you think differently about how you will advocate for systemic change, then we're winning. But we want to utilize strategy, and I can't stress enough to do manageable objectives. We don't want to get taken out of the game. That's the biggest fear I have about movements like we're in the middle of right now. How do we maintain our legitimacy and stay involved in the game? What I want to do is to burn the house down. I'm frustrated. I'm mad. I've taken it personally. That frustration is real. And it may not, I don't know that frustration gets the goals met all the time. We can accept that those feelings are valid. And if we want to affect change, how do we be intentional, utilize strategy, and create manageable wins, manageable objectives, so that our small unit of highly trained people, like we're putting together the A team here, our small unit of highly trained people can handle one objective at a time and build on that over time. An important part of that, if we want to blow up the Death Star, we got to do it from the inside out. So recognizing that as a reality, if we want for a small group of people to be able to affect a big system, we've got to infiltrate that system. We've got to be on the inside of the system. Here's where I would offer something. We get to make choices about how authentically we engage in that system. I choose to be as authentic and real as possible. I don't want to be a part of the system just to tear it down. I want to invest in a system so that I can build it to be more equitable and to be fair and to be what I want it to be. I think there's a big difference in that. So there are some realities of the world that I struggle with. If we did not have the criminal justice system at all, if we really did abolish law enforcement, what would happen in our communities? I don't think we know. I'd be scared to find out. That does not mean that I think the system is fair or just or equitable, or that racism isn't a massive problem in our system. But my perspective is that I think engaging that system means joining with it somehow, even when, like a family member I don't agree with. I'm going to find a way to get in there and do my best to change the system from the inside. Otherwise, it feels like it feels too daunting. If they know that you're coming with all your radical ideas, they may not understand the purpose. If we can get in that system, build trust, partnership, and then we can deploy these things intelligently, we remove resistance. And that's where I think we can be the most effective. What can we do tactically to remove resistance? When we talked about earlier that notion of the psychology of police officers, I think that's an important point there as well. If we can remove the resistance to growth and create something that's powerful out of it's like MI, right? So it's create something that's positive out of equality. It makes sense. I wish that we didn't have to do it, but we have to. But I'm thinking through, like, how do we make the choices that we need to make, decide what we're willing to pay and what we're willing to give to get inside that system, what type of risk we're willing to take to move in there. After we get in there, we affect our intervention, we review that whole thing, we figure out what happened, and then we go back to the very beginning, isolate and identify the new problem. Is it still there? Is it the same problem? Did we not affect anything? Did we affect one thing, but then we saw that there are the 20 other things that we need to work on? Which one of those do we want to pick next? Which one is the most pressing? And I think that is part of the way when I'm thinking about moving forward. So, I can't believe that we're still here. Let me kind of get into the question space. I'm going to stop the screen share.
Yeah, you're far from me too.
Okay. So
do we get to blame?
So I didn't know if somebody was intending to talk or if that was a question. I want to try to at least open up for the next few minutes. It's going to be difficult with so many people. But I just went in and muted everyone. If you do have a question, I think we can certainly open up the floor for questions and take as many as we can as we move forward. Feel free to, if you have a question, if you want to unmute and ask a question, go for it.
I had a question, and it's kind of building on a question that Stephanie put in the chat.
Okay.
She asked if there was research out there that shows which agencies are working well with an interdisciplinary team in law enforcement. And so I was wondering if there's any data on the effectiveness of these interdisciplinary teams, or if there's like any, basically, are there law enforcement agencies that have integrated social workers and mental health professionals and it's worked out well for them, especially if it saves money in any way? That could be a really good way to like get our foot in the door and build a case for a policy change.
Okay, good question. There is some data on that. What we've seen so far, particularly in the Northwest, is a great deal of multidisciplinary teamwork and the embedding of social workers in law enforcement agencies. We see that it does have a cultural impact. It doesn't fix all the problem, but it certainly helps, particularly with the units. And this probably comes as no surprise. The units where you have a social worker embedded tend to be more thoughtful, egalitarian, fair, just, etc. Right? So those, it does work. It's, but that goes back to a financial issue. It's about investing in prevention. And I think one of the strategies as we move forward is if we want to isolate some targets and think through how to really force or inspire, is probably a better word, systemic organizational change. Probably one of the quickest ways we can do that is through funding resources. So on a national policy place, rather than focusing funding on the militarization of police forces and granting large grant projects to increase weaponry, to what degree can we fund advances in community policing, for example? We do know from the data too that the better trained people are, the less likely they are to have fear-based racist responses. So that's another, from a training place, another really great investment. Does that stop individual racism? No, I don't know that we can have data to support that. But we do know that racism, when it combines with fear in a situation, there is data to show that, man, that's when problems happen. We saw that a couple of years ago when we were investigating all these police shootings against unarmed Black men. But great question. I think that's embedding social workers is a fantastic idea, although it is one that's more expensive.
I have a question. Once the financial piece is sorted out for these police departments, as far as providing social workers, what are some other barriers that you see? What are some other barriers that you've heard of, people coming up with, departments coming up with, barriers that you've seen with putting social workers in? Because we all think it's a fantastic idea, but I can kind of imagine that there are going to be some other police chiefs or other people who aren't interested in reinventing the wheel or tearing the system down and rebuilding it. So what are some barriers that we could expect that we need to be equipped to manage?
I think this is a great question. And we need to be really honest about this one. This is one that I struggle with and that I'll be very honest about. There has to be a cultural shift around what it means to be a police officer, what it means to be a peace officer. The organizational culture, there is a hierarchy of respect and honorableness. And the more risk that you're in, the more honorable you are, and the more status you have in the profession. So from an organizational culture place, these are some real things that we need to address these systemically. We need leadership to incentivize, and we need to make community policing or concepts of working with social workers, that needs to be, from an organizational culture place, respected, again, and incentivized. So some of the barriers that we run into, quite honestly, are that you get the people like I was early in my career, where I'm like, man, I grew up in a situation where I was highly influenced by events that had happened around me in my community. I wanted to catch bad guys. I believed that masculinity and maleness and goodness, being the hero that I wanted to be, meant that I would go catch bad guys. What I didn't understand was community involved approaches actually stop the creation of bad guys, right? Or whatever we would call it. They slow down violence. I was young and naive, and I bought into that culture in the way that it took years later for me to see, oh my gosh, what Tommy was doing saves more lives than what I was doing. And it's a pretty, it's a sobering thing to have to realize. We need to find ways to get into that organizational culture and reframe it. That's going to be a tough thing, but it starts from the top down too. I think when leadership incentivizes improvement, then that changes things. And Terrence, did you have a TJ?
Yeah, I got a question. Just as far as resources and policies that we can do right now to get something changed immediately, and then looking at short-term goals, long-term goals. Like, what are some things that we can do, be it advocacy, meeting with the police and various cities to come up with ways to get something changed now, because us as Black men, we're still dying at a disproportionately rate than whites and pretty much everyone else. Just like in Minnesota, making up 18% of the population, and still a vast majority of the incarcerations, the brutalities, etc. So I think we're at a point now where something has to be done. And the only thing that I can think of that would help in that direction is resources financially, do trainings or, whatever we could pull, and policy change.
One of the policy not to cut you off, but one of the policy changes that I think we can do now, we can do it today, are community-based advisory boards, particularly in regards to officer misconduct. I think we can reform, and it costs no money to reform the internal affairs process that reviews use of force and incorporates community perspectives. I think that's a low hanging fruit, and it creates, I think, to be tactical about it, having both the carrot and the stick. I think accountability to the community is a stick that is helpful. When the conversation about body cameras came out, I thought, man, I wish I would have had body cameras. I wish we would have had body cameras, because that way, if they know that I did what I had to do and not anything more than that. Right. If I had a body camera, then that relieves that doubt. It creates a better situation. So I think more accountability, more transparency, more community oversight, particularly in regards to use of force, is one of the quickest ways. And it's an easy policy change compared to some of the other things. I'm going to say it out loud in front of everybody. I want racists to be scared again. And not that they ever were, right? But community oversight helps. Right now we have a very interesting political landscape where people feel free. The picture I showed at the very beginning that we've all been dealing with, that man who was murdering another man was not worried at all about who saw it. It was an exhibition. That's a problem. If there was community oversight, I have a feeling that that's a strong incentive to at least not be so brazen about it, right? I think that's one thing. Funding is the next. How do we fund and support the right kinds of practices, training, all that kind of stuff that you mentioned, I think is really important. But the first step that I think everybody could do, every chief in the country could do really quickly, is some sort of community involved advisory board or intervention, some community involved assessment of use of force with officers and departments. Right now, the unions have a great deal of power in keeping internal affairs and use of force investigations private. That's a systemic issue in law enforcement in general. I think that first piece of accountability could be a low cost first step. And there's lots of other things too, but let's see, thinking how to spell rebranding as prevention, I think is another good idea. Do you have any other thoughts, TJ? I didn't mean to kind of.
Oh, no.
You got me fired up right there. I was like, I do know one thing. I know one thing we could do.
Well, yeah, no, and I think that's important because I think right now that's the bigger picture. I mean, it is a complex system, and I know that overall Americans want to see something done quickly to start the ball rolling, because even though this is the, I don't know what encounter for the year, I mean, this has been going, on for years. And so I think that is a good way, the advisory boards and the conduct. So to me, it sounds like we need to get on board with trying to get that power away from the unions to have those cases locked down, and then needs to become public knowledge. And
I think that's something we can do locally. We can start pressing locally for how do we get transparency and community involvement in use of force investigation. I think that Mayor Holt in Oklahoma City is talking about it and trying to explore it. I think Norman Police Department would be open to it. I've done a lot of work with both of those police departments. It's not an easy issue,
right?
Because the unions are going to fight against it. But this goes back to one of those very first things that I was saying. I think that it is a pro-police thing to root out racism in the organizational culture. The organization was built on the marginalization of people.
Right.
The United States, we have to own it.
Right.
Genocide, slavery, like this is our legacy. If we want to improve, we can. It's a good thing for everybody. So we got to reframe. It's got to be reframed. And I think part of that is the stick of accountability, and part of it is the carrot of how do we make this a positive thing to make progress. if that makes sense. It's we can do both of those. Funding takes a lot more. That's tough. But it's about repurposing existing funding too. Yeah, Dedrick, go ahead.
Okay, so I guess to kind of build on that, you as a cisgendered white male with a history with law enforcement,
Mm-hmm.
you are able to attain a seat at that table.
Yep.
And just as you displayed here, just as conversations that we've had, you're a wonderful advocate, wonderful ally. But how do we get myself, Terrence, Kate DeLeon, Monica Frey, just names I'm seeing on my screen, how do we get them a seat at the table in order for those conversations to happen? Because I don't doubt that those conversations are not happening, but I seriously doubt that they're getting a valid and persuasive argument from the people that are advocating.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it's a great question. Going back to that kind of, you need a breacher. You need somebody that's going to get you into the space. People like me have to open the door, have to bring you in and vouch you into the system, to bring in diversity into the system. I don't know how. I think that's the most efficient, effective way. And it has to be intentional.
And follow you like an assistant.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tell you one example. It doesn't solve all the problems, but just as one example, I'm the co-chair of the Legislative Advisory Board on Children of Incarcerated Parents in Oklahoma. Big, long title, right? We report back to the legislature every year, kind of about children of incarcerated parents and what we need to do, et cetera, et cetera. When I took on that spot, I looked around the room, and I think we had one, maybe two, out of 15 people, there might have been 2 people of color at the table. And I said, I think that we have to make a proactive effort to invite a more diverse group of people to the table. It is not that the people around that table don't care. And I tried my best to explain that. I know you care, and we need more voices. We need people to help us be accountable and understand things that we can't understand because we don't know to look for them. Got to have it. And it's going to, and that's hard. It's hard to, it's a complicated, it's interesting. It's interesting that I've found as an ally, so any of my people out here that are wondering, what can I do as a white person with a little bit of power in whatever space, or a man with a little bit of power in this space, or whatever. Every time that I've found over the past few years that I say something like that, it's received incredibly well. I'll be nervous about saying it, but I'll be like, but I made a promise to a group of students a few years back that every time I had a chance to say something, I would say something. And so that sticks in the back of my head. I'm like, oh God, I'm nervous. Somebody's not gonna like this. I've got a fight coming. Oh my God. I got to fight today, but then I'll remember I made that promise. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And then when I do it, everybody's like, oh man, I'm glad he said something. And if they're not, they're quiet because they know they better be, right? So I think part of it is any time that any of us has access to a table, we need to be bringing more people to the table, diverse voices to the table. It's hard to get in without, that's part of that. We got to find the gatekeepers, and we have to be willing to be gatekeepers, be willing to say it. Yeah. I think part of we get scared because we see the problems and we get really worried, and that can freeze us up. Man, we can't stop moving. That's what I was talking about. When you hit that door, when they know who you are, get in there. Like don't stand in that doorway. Get in that room and do what you came to do. And we gotta get in those spaces. So I don't know that that's the greatest answer, but I think that just like this talk today, I don't think this talk saves the world. I don't think it fixes all our problems, but I felt like because of my background, I need to say something, and I need to try to share something. we got multiple systems here that don't have to be in competition with each other, even though for 400 years in our country they have been. So, yeah, we got to get brave, intellectually, emotionally brave. And I think we'll be rewarded.
I mean, I'm trying to sit at the table. I got a lot to say.
I want you there. That's what you're ready. You're there. I got you. But yeah, we're seeing stuff in the comments. We have to keep the momentum. When the emotion dies down, how will we stay mobilized? Those are things we need to think about. The emotion's up right now, so how do we continue in this? We're just getting started. And I'll tell you, I don't think that, I think the fight is still ahead of us, but I'm at least finding some hope when I look at these crowds of protesters. And I see all the different people that are here together that don't know what to do, but man, we're trying to figure it out. That gives me a hopefulness that I've never had before. When I see protests in the past, I see pain, and I see that pain here too, but the diversity is cool. Something different is happening. It's the generation that's coming right now that's making something's different. How do we capitalize and keep that moving? We don't want to stop that momentum, which is part of this talk today. Like, the door's open now. We're here, so we got to keep going forward and take the whole thing. At least that's the perspective I have. What are any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, like, so easy. Yeah, we're just going to talk about it and it's done.
Yeah.
The work is ahead of us. The work is ahead. And it can't be led by people that look like me. We need to be listening, partnering, diversifying. I got to do my job. My job is to get us in the door and to keep tooting the horn and do the research. I can do the research. I can get the numbers together. But we each have our own role. We still have 90. I mean, we're over time right now. We're 10 minutes past time, and there are still 100 people on. So I know if people got to drop off, I completely understand it. Feel free to drop off. I don't know that we have any new content that'll come, but I'm glad to stay on and continue.
Dr. McLeod, let me just say, I'm pretty emotional, but let me just say thank you. And let me remind those who are still on, if you need CEUs, be sure to fill out your evaluation. Okay?
Yeah. Also, because thank you for helping. And that reminded me when you said something about CEUs. I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat. If you want to, here are some options. If you're thinking, I don't know what to do right now. There are 3 links in here that I just threw into the chat. One is for the OU Foundation for scholarships. We have multiple scholarships to support students of color. If you wanted to donate to any of those, you can designate how you would want that, $5, $10, whatever. And there's also a donation link to the Greenwood Cultural Center. So we mentioned the CE stuff. You can get CE for this. If you want to share those, we were talking about this right beforehand and saying, like, want the events to be free, don't want people's money, but if you want, there's a couple of ways to start working toward reparation. Little things that we can do. So those are in there in the chat, and thank you for reminding me of that and mentioning that, and for your help, Charlotte. I really appreciate it. What other thoughts might people have? Thank you. Yeah. Feel free if you need to go, head on. But if you have other stuff, any other questions or things you want to share with the group before we log off? All right. So I do want to be respectful of folks' time. I feel really honored to have been able to occupy this space for a couple hours today. I certainly didn't plan on it kind of turning into this. I hope that it will be helpful. Even if it's just a couple of things here or there that you might find helpful. I hope that they do. But I would also want to just reaffirm that this is an area that I'm committed to, and that we're all committed to, and that I know that more than likely there are things that I said today that I said incorrectly or said wrong. I don't doubt that. I tend to do that a lot. I'm trying to learn, and I apologize if the points weren't communicated as eloquently as I wish they could be. It's an emotional thing for all of us, and trying to figure out a way forward is tough. For me, I'm trying to think through how do we actually get something done. I'm tired of the talking about it. We know it's here, so what can we do to get it done, to start moving the right way? It took us hundreds of years to get into this crappy spot. It's going to take us a while to get out of it, but we can start doing stuff. So let's take off one little piece at a time and work together. Count me in if you need anything, and I'll let me know what I can do to support. Anybody else have anything before we call it a day? Thank you so much to everyone for being here. I look forward to hearing from you and seeing what we come up with. We'll be in this thing together. All right. I'll talk to y'all later. I'm gonna close it down. All right. Bye-bye, y'all.